Hello and welcome back. We're going to continue talking about pedigrees. This time we're going to go over an autosomal dominant pedigree. I've left all of the key over on this side so you remember what all of the symbols stand for. All right. One of the things I want you to note with the autosomal dominant pedigree is that there's going to be an affected individual in every generation. All right, that's something that's going to be characteristic of a particular trait that's inherited in an autosomal dominant fashion. Okay, whereas with our autosomal recessive, what you will very frequently see with autosomal recessive pedigrees is you will see that it will skip generations. Now I know in my previous video the way I drew the autosomal recessive pedigree, it didn't skip generations. Now it is possible to see the trait in every generation. But if you look in the PowerPoints, I've got some examples of pedigrees where you see no affected individuals in a particular generation. That's indicative of something that's autosomal recessive. Okay? The other thing that's very indicative of something being autosomal dominant is you have to have one parent who is affected, who has the disease. Okay? Now, in the case of the example I'm going to use, okay, the example I am going to use for an autosomal dominant trait is going to be Huntington's disease. Okay? Now this one's a little bit unique in that the homozygous dominant state for Huntington's is going to be lethal. Okay? That isn't true of all autosomal dominant traits, but it is true for Huntington's. Okay? So if we define our alleles, having a capital letter H means the person has Huntington's disease. And in this case, a lowercase h is going to indicate a normal or an unaffected individual. Okay? So that's something to keep in mind with this particular pedigree. All right? Now, in questions like this, if something is going to be homozygous lethal, if I ask this as a quiz question, I would tell you that information. I would tell you homozygous dominant is lethal, okay? That gives you information when you're constructing your pedigree. Because with autosomal dominant traits, what you don't know, okay, necessarily is what that second allele is, okay? You know they have to be capital H because they have the disease, okay? Typically with autosomal dominant traits, you're either going to be heterozygous or homozygous dominant, okay? But in the case of Huntington's, this is lethal, so we know this is not the case, okay? So we can say with this particular pedigree, this individual was heterozygous, mom was normal or is normal, all right, and doesn't have the disease. All right. If we look at the offspring, then we can fill this in with their genotypes. All right. On this end, the first daughter inherited the dominant allele from dad, recessive allele from mom, marries a man who is normal at the Huntington's locus. They have a son who is affected, a daughter who is unaffected, and a daughter who is affected. Okay. Now, in this case, I've drawn the daughter marrying an affected male, all right? Because I want to show you this is another way you can figure out whether or not a trait is traveling as heterozygous or homozygous dominant, all right? If you don't have that bit of information, okay? So in this case, it is possible for two affected individuals to have an unaffected child because that first daughter inherited a recessive allele from mom and a recessive allele from dad, okay? And then in this case, they've got a daughter that's affected, maybe inherited the dominant allele from mom, recessive allele from dad, could have worked the other way, okay? So that's something with homozygous dominant traits to watch out for. All right. The other thing with autosomal dominant traits is that over here we have an unaffected daughter who marries an unaffected male. Their children are unaffected. If this daughter marries an unaffected male, all of their children are unaffected. Oop, that's an H. Really, it's an H. Okay? The key with an autosomal dominant trait is that if both parents are unaffected, it's not possible for them to have an affected child, okay, with an autosomal dominant pedigree. All right? So the Huntington's is a little bit special as far as how it's transmitted, because normally if someone is heterozygous, we represent them as a carrier, okay? But remember, that isn't always going to be true, all right? If the individual has the disease, we would shade them in completely, okay? So Huntington's is a little different as far as an autosomal dominant inheritance trait, but I wanted to go over it because it's a little bit different. It doesn't go by the standards that you'll see in your textbook, all right? If you have any questions, please let me know. Next video, I'm going to go over a trait that would be sex-linked, all right? Thank you for your attention.